no wrong here, and we don't understand how we're getting so much hate behind it. We all cared and loved Nolan, and nobody wanted to see Nolan die. Nobody wanted to see his life be taken so short.
All right, Kajachi, and also legal analyst and attorney Brian Buckmeyer join me now for more. So, Ike, what more are we learning about why Wells stayed behind and didn't go back to the mainland with his friends?
Yeah, Kara, this has really been at the center of everything. This question, why did Nolan Wells stay behind when everyone else decided to actually leave the island? Well, now we're hearing from someone who was there that day. His childhood friend, Trayston Shepard, said that the boat that they came on experienced an electrical issue and they had to go back to shore because of that. And he says Nolan told the group he wanted to stay behind because he met a girl and planned to catch a ride back on another friend's boat. Now, Shepard described this trip as one last hurrah before everyone scattered back to school and work after this holiday. There were about 300 people on that island that day. A lot of them were high school classmates. They knew each other, and they wanted to spend this time as just one big party before everyone dispersed wherever they needed to go. But according to his friend, Trayston Shepard said that this wasn't anything sinister at all. It was an 18-year-old who wanted to have fun, but Kira, as we know, that 18-year-old Nolan Wells never made it back to shore.
Well, and Brian, Trayston also addressed the viral video. Investigators, I've been looking into, saying he's actually the one yelling, not Wells. How crucial is that?
Kira, I think it's very crucial in the sense of now we know who's yelling, why they were yelling, and according to Trayston, it had nothing to do with what Nolan Wells was doing. Instead, giving us a description that a stranger was kind of getting in his face and he was yelling at him. This closed down one avenue of investigation, and while that might be heartbreaking that it doesn't give us an answer, eliminating possibilities as to what happened will hopefully steer us in the right direction, finding the right reason as to why everything happened. And then going back to something that Ike said, I hope that with Trayston saying Wells was there talking to a girl, that we can get a description of that girl, what she was wearing, who she might be, and follow up on more questions.
So then, Brian, at this point of the investigation, it's the autopsy that I know we're all waiting to hear about, because that will definitely help us try to figure out what exactly happened, right?
Yes, the autopsy is probably the next step and probably the biggest step in determining what happened here. Autopsies do two things. It tells you the cause of death and the manner of death. It could be any number of things in terms of being a homicide, an accident. I don't believe it's going to be a natural death, but that determination is going to be important. But then also, of course, the cause. What caused Nolan Wells to die? Is it strictly the drowning? Was it something else? Is there blunt force trauma? That's going to give us a lot more answers and hopefully some questions that lead to the ultimate question and answer of what happened to Nolan Wells and how did he die.
All right, Ike, Brian, thank you both.
Something shifted in the Nolan Wells case. Not in a courtroom, not in a lab, in a chair, in front of a camera, when one of the people who was actually there finally opened his mouth. For weeks, the people closest to Nolan Wells on the day he disappeared said almost nothing in public. Silence from the friend group. Silence from the boat owner. Silence from almost everyone except lawyers and search volunteers. That silence became its own kind of story. People filled it with theories, with screenshots, with slowed-down video and zoomed-in swimsuits. And then, according to two separate interviews first reported by ABC News and by People magazine, that silence broke, twice, in the span of a few weeks. Two people who were part of Nolan's world before July 4th Saturday down, on camera, and described what they say they saw. What they said didn't close the case. If anything, it opened up new questions the internet hadn't even thought to ask yet. And it forced a lot of people who had already made up their minds to go back and rewatch everything they thought they understood. Before we get into what was actually said, here's where this case stands today, according to the most recent reporting from News Nation and the Washington Informer, because that's the part almost nobody is covering accurately. News Nation reports the state autopsy on Nolan Wells has been completed. It is not public. It's sealed, waiting to be presented to a grand jury that hasn't convened yet. The Washington Informer, citing family attorney Ben Crump, reports that forensic audio specialists are currently working through the entire emergency call from that afternoon, not just the 12 seconds everyone's been arguing about online. That same reporting says ocean engineering experts are separately trying to answer a much stranger question. whether the spot where Nolan's body was ultimately found lines up with where the tides that day would have actually carried him. And according to attorney Eric Hertz, quoted in that same Washington Informer report, a joint examination of phones connected to this case is being negotiated right now, one that could eventually pull in the FBI. This is not a cold case. It is an active one, moving in real time, and today we're going to walk through exactly what's changed since our last video, according to the outlets actually covering it on the ground, starting with the two interviews that shifted the entire conversation. It's worth pausing on just how fast this case has moved since Nolan disappeared. In the span of about a month, it's gone from a local missing persons report covered by Mississippi's WLOX to a story CNN, CBS News, News Nation, ABC News, and Capital B News have all covered in depth, pulling in civil rights attorneys, a former FBI agent, a sitting district attorney, and millions of people online who've never set foot in Mississippi. That kind of speed cuts both ways. It means more outlets checking each other's reporting. It also means more room for a single unverified claim, first amplified far outside traditional news coverage, to spread further and faster than the correction that eventually follows it. Both of those forces are running at the same time right now, and you're about to see exactly how that plays out. Quick note before we go further. This case involves the death of a young man and disputed circumstances around it. Nothing graphic is coming, but if that subject matter is heavy for you tonight, take care of yourself. If you're new to this channel, this is Cold Crime Central, and we track cases like this one from the ground up, update by update, sourced directly from the outlets actually doing the reporting without the noise. If you want to be here the moment the grand jury decision actually drops, this is the place to subscribe for that. Now let's get into what these two friends actually told reporters. For most of July, there was exactly one version of events getting airtime, and it wasn't coming from anyone who was actually on the water that day. It was coming from commentators, from audio engineers, from people analyzing swimsuit patterns in grainy video. The people who were physically present on Horn Island had mostly gone quiet, and their lawyers weren't exactly encouraging them to change that. Then, in the third week of July, that started to change, according to reporting from People magazine, which was later picked up and republished by both Yahoo News and AOL. The first to speak was a young man named Hudson, someone People reports had been close with Nolan since the 8th grade. He sat down for an interview on a podcast hosted by conservative commentator Brandon Tatum, known as the Officer Tatum, and People's coverage of that conversation, published in 2 parts, described it as Hudson's first public account of what he saw in his friend's final hours. What he described wasn't a confession or a bombshell. It was something almost more useful than that, an ordinary, detailed account of what an ordinary day on the water actually looks like out there, told by someone who was living it in real time rather than reconstructing it from a screenshot months later. According to People's report, Hudson said the friend group had been talking about this trip for weeks, describing the 4th of July on Horn Island as one of the most popular days of the year on that stretch of water, with what he estimated at close to 4,000 people and miles of boats scattered across the island by afternoon. That number matters, because a lot of the online theorizing about this case has treated Horn Island that day like an isolated location with a small, contained group of suspects. Hudson's account, as reported, paints something closer to a floating festival, most of the boats belonging to people who had no connection to Nolan or his friend group at all. The same People report also carried the first detailed physical description of the water itself, and it lines up with something investigators have flagged separately in reporting from CBS News. When boats were tied together the way many were that day, Hudson said, jumping off the front of one could put you in water close to neck deep. Jumping off the back put you closer to waist deep. He described conditions as a little rough on the way back that evening, but said it was nothing his friend's boats couldn't handle. It's a small detail, but it matters, because it's an eyewitness account independently lining up with the water depth observations later flagged in the United Cajun Navy's own photo timeline. On the subject of Nolan specifically, People's reporting notes that Hudson didn't claim to have spent the day glued to his side. He said they talked a couple of times over the course of the day, the way you would with any friend in a crowd that size, and that Nolan seemed fine, present, social, drinking along with most of the group, nothing that struck him as unusual or alarming in the moment. That's a detail worth sitting with, because according to this account, The last documented eyewitness impression of Nolan Wells that day is of someone acting completely normal. Hudson also addressed, according to the same reporting, one of the more persistent threads in the online version of this case, the idea that Nolan's relationship with his parents had somehow changed or grown distant. He told people he didn't personally know Christine and Elmore well, but that it never affected his friendship with Nolan in any way he noticed. It's a small comment in the original interview, but it matters, because a lot of speculative theories in this case have tried to build a motive or a hidden rift out of family relationships nobody outside that family actually has visibility into. Hudson's account, as published, doesn't support that theory. The second interview came from a different friend, Trace's Tin Shepard, and according to ABC News, which broadcast the interview as an exclusive, this one directly reshaped a piece of evidence that had already gone viral. ABC News reported that for weeks, a video had been circulating online showing a tense moment on the shoreline, a raised voice demanding something back, and viewers online had convinced themselves the voice belonged to Nolan, arguing with someone right before he vanished. According to ABC News's reporting, family attorney Ben Crump had previously described the same video publicly as showing Wells among a group of people standing on the island. Shepard told ABC News that the voice on that video wasn't Nolan's at all. It was his own. He said he was the one demanding his phone back from someone, and that the moment had nothing to do with Nolan whatsoever. If that account holds up, and no outlet has publicly contradicted it since ABC News's report aired, it means one of the most widely shared pieces of what people believed was evidence in this case was never evidence of anything involving Nolan at all. It was a misidentified voice in a crowd of thousands, stitched into a narrative because the timing and the tension happened to fit what people already wanted to believe. Think about how that video actually spread before Shepard corrected the record. Someone online decided the raised voice belonged to Nolan. That claim got repeated, then screenshotted, then folded into longer compilation videos alongside the CTO audio and the photo timeline, until it became just another accepted fact in a case increasingly built out of accepted facts nobody had verified through an actual outlet. ABC News also reported that Shepard said he'd known Nolan since their freshman year at Ocean Springs High School, that they bonded through athletics, and that he described their friend group to reporters as, in his words, very diverse. That doesn't erase the real conversation happening nationally about race and how this case has been investigated, a conversation Capital B News and The Advocate have both covered at length. It does complicate the simplest version of that conversation, the one that treats the friend group itself as a flat, uniform block. Here's why these two interviews matter more than almost anything reported before them. 4 weeks, this case ran almost entirely on second-hand analysis. Audio enhancements from people who weren't there, photo timelines built from strangers' phones, theories stacked on theories. Hudson and Shepard are two of the only people who've spoken on the record, to actual news organizations, who were standing on that island. Neither people's coverage nor ABC News's coverage claims either man-handed reporters a tidy answer. Neither confirmed the darkest theories circulating, and neither fully closed the door on the idea that something about that day still doesn't add up. What they did, according to the outlets that interviewed them, was correct the record in specific, verifiable ways, and shift the conversation from speculation about strangers in a video back toward the actual open questions in this case. And that shift didn't sit well with everyone. Almost immediately after People and ABC News published these interviews, parts of the online true crime community pushed back, arguing that speaking up this late, months after Nolan disappeared, only deepened suspicion rather than resolving it. Some pointed out that a delayed account, given to a national outlet after weeks of public commentary, is harder to independently verify than one given in the first days after a tragedy. That's a fair, reasonable point on its own. It doesn't automatically mean either friend is being dishonest, but it does mean their accounts will likely face more scrutiny from other outlets than an account given in the immediate aftermath would have. That reaction tells you something important about where public trust in this case currently sits. Even a straightforward, detailed, credibly sourced account is being read through a lens of suspicion, because so much of what's circulated online before it turned out to be wrong, misleading, or flatly fabricated. When the information environment around a case gets poisoned enough times, even reporting from established outlets starts to sound, to some viewers, like it needs a disclaimer. That's the environment Hudson and Shepard chose to step into, and it's worth remembering as we move into the next major thread in this case, one where separating verified reporting from noise gets a lot harder before it gets easier. If Hudson and Shepard's interviews were about correcting the record, the next major thread in this case is about a single piece of audio that refuses to be settled no matter how many outlets take a pass at it. According to a timeline first published by WOX and later confirmed by CNN, sometime around 4 in the afternoon on July 4th, as the boat carrying Nolan's friends began taking on water near Horn Island, someone placed a call to the private towing company Sea-Tow. That call, on its own, should have been a footnote. Instead, TMZ reported in late July that internet listeners had become convinced they could hear something else buried underneath the static of that recording: specific words, specific names, specific accusations, including a widely repeated claim that a background voice could be heard asking whether someone was dead. The first person to actually put technical work into that recording was an independent audio engineer named Janetta Brantley. Her enhanced version of the call, muting certain channels and boosting others, was covered by multiple outlets tracking the case, and she was upfront in her own public statements that what she produced was her own interpretation of degraded audio, not a forensic transcript. Her work spread fast, and so did the theories built on top of it. Weeks later, according to coverage of Nancy Grace's own program, a producer on her show, identified on air as Sydney, did an independent pass at the same recording, using a similar method, muting the primary callers and raising the volume on everything happening in the background. Her version reportedly picked up even more than earlier attempts, including what some listeners believe is a name spoken in anger and a phrase that sounds like a reference to covering something up. That raised an uncomfortable question a number of commentators pointed out almost immediately, and it's one worth putting to any outlet still covering this story. Two people, working independently, using comparable methods on the same recording, got treated very differently by parts of the public. Janetta Brantley, a named independent audio engineer with documented experience in this kind of work, published her enhancement first, under her own name, with the same honest caveat that it reflected her personal interpretation. It took a producer on a nationally televised host's own show doing essentially the same thing for a large segment of that same audience to start treating the underlying recording as credible. That's not a claim about anyone's intentions. It's a fair, specific question about why comparable work from two named individuals got measured by different standards, and it deserves the same scrutiny either way. Here's the problem, and it's a real one, documented in reporting on the case rather than internet speculation. A digital forensics expert who examined an earlier enhancement of this exact recording found that the file didn't match the original. It ran 20 seconds longer than the source audio and carried a completely different digital fingerprint. That's not a minor technical footnote. It means at least one version of this recording that circulated publicly and shaped public opinion did not actually match the real emergency call it claimed to be enhancing. There's also a basic audio principle that gets lost every time this recording resurfaces in a new video. Turning up the volume on background noise doesn't add information that wasn't there. It amplifies everything equally: wind, water, overlapping voices, static, along with anything resembling speech. That doesn't mean everyone who's heard something in this recording is lying or imagining it. It means volume alone can't tell real, intelligible speech apart from that effect, and no outlet enhancing this recording with a volume slider has the tools to make that distinction reliably. This is exactly why the update reported by the Washington Informer in Chapter 1 matters so much. As of the most recent reporting, credentialed forensic audio specialists, not independent engineers working alone, not a cable news producer, are working through the complete, unedited Sea-Tow call for the first time. That's a fundamentally different process than anything reported on this recording so far. It's slower, it's less dramatic, and it won't produce a viral 30-second clip. But according to attorney Ben Crump's own statement to the Washington Informer, it's the first attempt at an answer that could actually hold up. Real forensic audio analysis doesn't work the way a volume slider does. It involves isolating specific frequency ranges, filtering out mechanical and environmental noise like wind and engine hum, and cross-referencing waveform patterns against known speech markers, a process that can take weeks rather than an afternoon. It's also a process that can produce a negative result, a conclusion that a given phrase simply isn't there, which is exactly the kind of finding that doesn't go viral but might actually matter most to a grand jury deciding what's real and what isn't. One more thing worth saying clearly, because it matters to a real person connected to this case and to how responsibly this should be reported going forward. One of the phrases repeatedly claimed to be audible in this recording involves the name of a specific, already identified individual, someone who has not been charged with anything and whose family, according to public statements, says he's already been harassed and threatened over earlier, unconfirmed claims about this same audio. Repeating a new, unverified version of that claim without the same caveat every outlet involved has used so far would be the same mistake that's already caused real harm once. No credentialed forensic body has confirmed that phrase. Not the first version, not the second, not the third. While the audio fight played out across cable news and social media, a very different kind of evidence was quietly being assembled by volunteers who weren't trying to go viral at all. The organization known as the United Cajun Navy has been involved in this case since the search itself, and its vice president, Brian Trasher, has been careful in every interview covering this timeline to describe what his organization put together as a timeline, not an investigation. That distinction matters, and it's one Trasher has repeated on air. His team asked the public directly, if you were on Horn Island that day and you have photos or video, send it in. What came back was compiled into a single organized document, without independent verification of every timestamp, and Trasher has been upfront about that limitation every time he's discussed it publicly. It's worth remembering how this search actually started, because reporting from CNN explains why volunteer documentation like Trasher's ended up filling a gap official resources couldn't. According to CNN's timeline, on July 5th, State Marine Resources officials launched 2 separate drone flights to survey the western side of the island. Extreme heat that afternoon caused the drone batteries to swell, cutting both flights short before they could cover meaningful ground. That's not a cover-up or a conspiracy, according to the same reporting. It's a real operational failure, the kind that happens during difficult searches in harsh conditions, and it's a big part of why Nolan's body wasn't located until the following morning, and why crowdsourced material from ordinary people on the water ended up mattering as much as it did. The most significant image in the Cajun Navy's compilation, covered in a segment featuring New York Post senior national correspondent Caitlin Becker, shows a cluster of boats tied together near the island, later labeled in the report as Boat 1, Boat 2, Boat 3, and Boat X, with a note identifying which one is believed to be the vessel Nolan came out on. According to Becker's on-air analysis, the photo doesn't show a crime and doesn't show a struggle. What it shows, in her assessment, is how many people were physically close enough, at some point that afternoon, to have potentially seen something. It's not evidence of wrongdoing. It's a map of who investigators still need to talk to. A second detail in that same compilation, discussed at length in the same segment, is easy to scroll past but genuinely important. Several of the submitted photos show people in water up to their chest or their neck, not wading, closer to treading water. Trasher flagged this specifically because Horn Island's underwater slope is aggressive. You can go from standing in shallow water to genuinely out of your depth in a matter of steps. That's not speculation about what happened to Nolan specifically. It's context for how much less margin for error existed out there that afternoon than the casual, everybody was just hanging out framing of this case has generally suggested in less careful coverage. And notably, it lines up almost exactly with what Hudson independently told people, without any apparent coordination between the two accounts. To be fair to the skeptics here, a veteran trial lawyer reviewing this same report on air raised a legitimate criticism. None of these photos have verified timestamps. None of them have been checked for tampering or manipulation. Without that verification, a compiled photo report isn't something a prosecutor can build a courtroom case on directly. That's a fair, technically accurate point, and outlets covering the story have generally included it rather than treating the Cajun Navy's report as conclusive on its own. But every real investigation starts with unverified material before it becomes verified. An unconfirmed timestamp isn't worthless. It's a lead that still needs actual investigative legwork behind it, subpoenas, interviews, corroboration. And according to reporting that cites roughly 60 witnesses interviewed so far, that legwork appears to be happening. That number suggests the cluster of boats in that photo isn't just sitting there unexamined. It's actively being worked through, one name at a time. Also worth noting, criminal defense attorney and registered nurse Marie Pereira has weighed in publicly on the broader witness question, emphasizing in her own on-air commentary that a pool of witnesses this large is exactly the kind of resource that, if worked correctly, tends to eventually produce consistency or contradiction, one or the other. 60 accounts either start lining up with each other over time, or they don't. Either outcome tells investigators something. There's one more practical thread worth understanding here, because it's less exciting than an audio clip but potentially more useful to investigators, and it's a detail Trasher has addressed directly in interviews. Every registered boat carries an identifying number, similar in principle to a license plate, and in many cases a name as well. If a boat visible in one of the submitted photos can be matched to its registration, that boat's owner can be identified and asked directly who was on board that day and what they remember. It's slow, unglamorous investigative work, cross-referencing hull numbers against state registries, but it's exactly the kind of work that turns a photo of strangers into a list of names investigators can actually sit down with. Trasher has said publicly that his organization has been comparing notes with the sheriff's office on exactly this kind of detail, and that a number of people who recognize their own boats in circulated photos have come forward voluntarily to say where they were and who they were with. At the center of this entire case sits one unaccounted for minute, the gap between the last moment Nolan Wells was seen by people who knew him and whatever happened after that. Katie McCormick, 19 years old and identified by name in reporting from the Daily Mail and referenced in subsequent News Nation coverage, is the person Nolan reportedly stayed behind to talk to as his friends were preparing to leave the island. Her account, first relayed through her sister in an early public post and later repeated directly by Katie herself in a separate, on-record conversation, has stayed consistent on one specific point across both tellings, according to the outlets that have covered it. She says that when she and Nolan said goodbye, he told her he intended to head back and rejoin his friends. She has never claimed, in either version reported, to have watched him actually get on that boat. She's describing what he told her he planned to do, not something she personally witnessed happen afterward. That's an important distinction, and it's one that's gotten lost in a lot of the online commentary about Katie specifically, commentary that has spent far more energy analyzing swimsuit colors in unrelated videos than actually engaging with what's been reported about what she said on the record. Set that next to the account attributed to a friend named Warren in separate coverage of the case, and the real tension in this case starts to come into focus. Warren has said on camera, in comments reported alongside other friend group interviews, that Nolan was asked multiple times to get on the boat before it left, and that he verbally refused, choosing instead to stay behind and catch a ride separately with someone else. Go back through both versions of Katie's account as reported, and neither one describes Nolan actually saying that. Not to her. She describes hearing the group call for him. She describes assuming reasonably that he'd get on because of that. She never describes him answering out loud, refusing, the way Warren's reported account has him doing in specific, quotable language. That gap matters. It's possible Katie simply wasn't close enough in that exact moment to hear whatever Nolan said back to his friends, and that's a completely reasonable, human explanation. It's also possible these are two genuinely different versions of that final minute, one where Nolan made a clear, deliberate choice to stay, spoken and heard by the group, and one where nobody who's gone on record with a news organization ever heard him say anything back at all. It's also worth acknowledging why this particular gap has resisted every attempt by reporters to close it so far. Katie's account and Warren's account aren't necessarily in conflict because either one is lying. They could both be honest descriptions of the exact same few minutes, filtered through two different vantage points on a crowded shoreline, at the end of a long day, with hundreds of other people and dozens of other boats creating noise and motion around them. Memory under those conditions isn't a recording. It's reconstruction, shaped by where someone was standing, what they were focused on, and what they assumed was happening around them. That doesn't make either account worthless. It means outlets covering this case can't simply take one at face value over the other without something else to corroborate it, whether that's a third witness, a piece of video, or the forensic audio review currently underway on the sea tow call itself. Nobody outside that moment actually knows which version is accurate, and it's worth being honest about that instead of picking a side for the sake of a cleaner story. What's not in dispute, according to reporting on the case, is this: Bart Edmonston, the owner of the boat that began taking on water that afternoon, has been named in coverage as the person who personally intervened to tow the disabled vessel rather than waiting on paid assistance. Some coverage has also connected Katie to a later ride home involving a marina co-owned by a man named Marty McGrath. That detail has been stated publicly in some reporting, but it hasn't been independently confirmed by a major outlet beyond that reporting, and it doesn't deserve to be treated as more significant than it currently is. What actually matters here isn't a marina, and it isn't a swimsuit. It's the fact that two people who were both close to Nolan in his final documented minutes have given accounts, through separate interviews with separate outlets, that don't fully match each other on the single most important detail in this entire case: whether Nolan ever spoke a refusal out loud. That's the real open question sitting underneath everything else, and it's the one investigators, not commentators, still have to resolve. Behind the interviews and the audio and the photos, there's an actual investigation underway, and it's worth understanding how it's actually being criticized by people with real professional experience, not just online commentators. A former county prosecutor with a background in homicide cases has publicly criticized, in televised commentary covering the case, how Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath has handled communication with the public. His argument, as reported, isn't that the investigation itself is being mishandled. It's narrower and more specific than that. He's argued that her office could disclose the volume of investigative work being done, how many search warrants have been issued, how many witnesses have been interviewed, what kinds of experts have been brought in, without revealing a single actual finding or compromising the grand jury process. Attorney Ben Crump, representing Nolan's parents, and attorney Eric Hertz, leading a separate independent investigation on the family's behalf, have taken a more direct approach, according to press conference coverage from NewsNation, WLBT, and the Black Wall Street Times. Their team commissioned an independent autopsy, presented publicly at the NAACP's National Convention, according to reporting from the Washington Informer and Capital B News, conducted their own review of available evidence, and have pushed publicly for a joint forensic examination of phones connected to the case. One Hertz has said could eventually involve the FBI if it moves forward. It's worth being precise here, in the way responsible reporting on this case has generally tried to be. The independent autopsy findings belong to the family's own investigation. The official state autopsy remains completed but sealed, pending presentation to a grand jury, according to NewsNation's most recent reporting, and those two things should not be treated as the same thing or given equal legal weight, even though they're often reported side by side. Hertz has also said, in comments carried by the Washington Informer, that he wants a joint examination of phones connected to this case, rather than separate reviews conducted independently by each side, specifically because a joint process is harder to later dispute in front of a grand jury or, if it comes to that, a jury at trial. Both sides examining the same data at the same time, under the same conditions, removes one of the most common arguments a defense or a prosecution can make later, that the other side's evidence was handled improperly. That's a procedural detail, not a dramatic one, but it's the kind of decision that actually determines whether evidence holds up months from now. The race dimension of this case hasn't faded into the background, and it shouldn't be flattened into a simple headline either. Nolan Wells was black, and questions about how his disappearance was investigated compared to how similar cases involving white teenagers have historically been handled were raised publicly and immediately by figures including historian Ibram X. Kendi, in comments reported by Capital B News, and sports commentator Stephen A. Smith, who pushed for the same urgency and resources any missing teenager's family should expect during an on-air interview on NewsNation's Cuomo. That's a real, legitimate line of public accountability, and it's part of why this case drew national attention as fast as it did. At the same time, some coverage has pushed back on how that racial framing has been applied. An opinion piece published by Unheard argued that the friend group's own description of itself as genuinely diverse complicates any version of this story that treats it as a simple, isolated narrative, and questioned how much of the national reaction reflected the specific facts of this case versus broader anxieties. It's a piece worth acknowledging precisely because it's a minority position in the overall coverage, and because outlets like ABC News reporting Shepard's own description of the friend group as diverse lend it at least some factual grounding, even if most national coverage has continued to center the racial accountability question as the primary lens on this story. Both things can be true. The broader pattern of national concern about how Black missing persons cases get investigated, documented extensively by Capital B News and The Advocate, is real and well established. And the specific friend group Nolan spent that day with appears, according to his own friends' accounts, to have been more mixed than some early coverage assumed. Neither fact cancels out the other. Some commentators covering this case have drawn comparisons to other deaths of young Black people under disputed or unclear circumstances, cases where initial official explanations were later challenged or revised after public pressure. Those comparisons aren't drawn to suggest this case is identical to any other. They're drawn because they explain, in part, why so many people who have no personal connection to Nolan or to Mississippi felt compelled to pay close attention from the very first week, and why the demand for transparency from local officials became a national story rather than a regional one, covered by outlets from CNN to the Washington Informer to the New York Post. There's also a documented, uglier consequence of how viral this case has become, and it deserves to be reported plainly because it's not speculation. According to the Washington Informer's most recent reporting, at least 3 separate people, in 3 separate states, have been arrested for making threats connected to this case, including threats against a named witness and against Jackson County officials handling the investigation. That's not an abstract warning about internet behavior. Those are actual arrests, actual criminal charges, actual consequences for people who decided unverified online theories were worth threatening real people over. As of the most recent official information reported by NewsNation, authorities have not said they suspect foul play, and the working theory investigators have described remains accidental drowning. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, reviewing the case independently in comments carried by NewsNation, said the evidence as she understands it currently points toward an accident, while also cautioning that more details could still emerge before this is finished. That's not a conclusion. It's one experienced professional's read on where things currently stand, offered alongside a clear acknowledgement reported by the same outlet that the picture isn't complete yet. It's worth sitting with the gap between that professional assessment and the volume of public suspicions still surrounding this case. Both can coexist without contradiction. An experienced investigator looking at the evidence gathered so far can genuinely believe it points toward an accident, while a family and a community can still, reasonably, want every remaining question fully closed out before accepting that as the final word. Wanting more answers isn't the same as rejecting the evidence that already exists. It's what any family in this position would want, and it's why the sealed autopsy and the pending grand jury matter as much as they do. Right now, the working theory and the final official answer are not the same thing, and this case won't be finished, in the eyes of the outlets still covering it, until they are. Strip away the audio arguments, the swimsuit theories, and the competing interviews, and here's what's actually true about the Nolan Wells case right now, according to the outlets actually reporting on it, all at once, in one place, for the first time in this video. The state autopsy is finished and sealed, waiting on a grand jury that hasn't convened yet, per NewsNation. The full, unedited emergency call is currently being examined by credentialed forensic audio specialists for the first time, according to the Washington Informer, replacing 3 competing amateur enhancements with something that could actually hold up under scrutiny. Ocean engineering experts are separately trying to determine whether the location where Nolan's body was recovered is even consistent with the tides that day, a question the family's own legal team says is still unanswered. A joint forensic review of phones tied to this case is being negotiated, one that could eventually involve federal investigators. And 2 of the only people who were actually there, Hudson and Tracyston Shepard, have finally gone on record with People and ABC News respectively, correcting at least one major piece of viral misinformation in the process while raising the bar for what an honest, sourced account of that day actually sounds like. What the grand jury will eventually decide isn't some abstract version of the truth. It's a specific, narrower legal question, whether the evidence gathered supports criminal charges against anyone connected to what happened that day. That's it. That's what this next stage of the process actually determines, no more and no less, and it's worth being clear about that instead of letting expectations run ahead of what a grand jury is actually built to do. What is certain is that a family is still waiting for something official, something they can actually stand on, and a community that has been watching this case since the first week of July, across outlets from local Mississippi stations to national networks, isn't going anywhere until they get it. Hudson and Shepard broke their silence and moved this story forward in real, measurable ways. It's worth remembering that as more names potentially step forward in the weeks ahead, whether that's another friend, another witness pulled from the Cajun Navy's photo pool, or someone connected to the boats still being traced back to their owners. This case has shown, twice now, that a single honest, on-record account, given to a real news organization, can do more to correct the public record than weeks of unsourced viral speculation ever could.